facing is that the challenge between the low price and the high daily operation subsidy. And maybe you know that the investments on the rail are all from the local governments, and there are no investments from the central government. And low ticket price is a policy to promote the public transportation first in China. So many in many cities in China, the subway ticket price is relatively low. And for example, in Beijing, the ticket price for one trip is only 2 RMB. It's about 20 cents. But the subsidy is really high. In 2011, the daily operation subsidy for the subways in Beijing is about 2 billion. So it's really the financing sustainability is really a challenge for Beijing government. And the four problems we are facing is about the operation safety oversight, and now there is still we still don't have one regulation on public transportation, and now we are drafting one regulation on public transportation, and the safety oversight is included. But I have to say that I said that there are no investments from the central government, so the policy is that there may be an unfunded mandate. So for the MOT, I mean the Ministry of Transportation, is responsible for the daily operation safety oversight. So it's very hard for the MOT to perform the safety, the operation safety oversight, because the Ministry of Transportation is not involved in the early planning and construction, and which is responsible, MOC, Ministry of Construction, is responsible for the planning and construction of underground rail projects. So there are 2 departments are involved in underground rail project. One is responsible for the earlier stage, and one is responsible for the daily operation. So it's very a challenge for the Ministry of Transportation. And in terms of the lessons from the mega projects, and I have to say that it's not so easy. It's not so easy to determine whether an underground rail project is successful or failure not for us, because of the cultural and institutional issues. And now promoting public transportation is a policy in China because of the bad traffic congestion, air pollution, and more private cars in cities, especially in large cities like Beijing and Shanghai. The local governments have to more and more money on the subway construction. In order to promote the public transportation first, they have no choice but to put money on the subway construction. So, but one thing is it's great. The boss think about it is that the underground rail project should be treated as an open system, and the financing, construction, daily operation, and safety oversight should be taken into account when planning. And I want to say that now in Beijing, the transportation planning and the urban planning, and I think that the transportation planning should be the first to the transportation planning. Okay, thank you.
have questions for the panel after or for comments. So, Mohan.
Thank you very much. When I was requested, our center was requested to nominate one person, and the head of our center chose me. And it's very frightening. That's why I have a great deal of respect for Harry and his team, because I would have never had the courage to do such a project. And I think you should take our comment seriously, because 4 of us represent about 3 billion people. Actually, the context has been mentioned, how things have changed and so on over history. But if you look at issues of decision making regarding science and technology, I don't think much has changed in a century. Because the appeal of technological machismo has not changed at all, for at least a century. And since men made most of the decisions, so machismo is really important. And I think that decides a lot as far as mega projects are concerned. Also, I don't think we have really moved away from concepts of technological determinism or scientific positivism. I think those are the 2 issues, especially scientific positivism from the 19th century, early 19th century, which dominate our brains in the way we are taught about technology and science being neutral. Especially sophisticated technology or big technology has social issues embedded in them genetically. So, and that depends on where that technology originates, because the way the technology originates embeds social issues in the technology. And by and large, when that technology gets implemented anywhere in the world, it implements that social construct as far as possible. And if that social construct doesn't suit the local, not culture, but the local socio-economic conditions, then the technology will produce a social construct of the place where it came from within that socio-economic conditions. And I think that's a very, very important issue in understanding how technology moves. And discussion on this has reduced a great deal after the 1970s. It was quite prominent earlier. And for many reasons, especially neoliberalism, we don't want to discuss it. And so I think that's part of the problem. And I think the whole issue of any sexy technology or meta technology is that it always looks for problems. So it's solutions chasing problems. Not that you have a problem and you want to find a solution. So once you have a solution, it goes around the world looking for problems and to apply it. And I think that's, again, a part of the problem when we talk about the context. How much does it resonate? I guess you can only resonate if your natural frequency is within that bandwidth. If your natural frequency is outside bandwidth, you can't resonate. So it's a difficult question to answer whether it resonates, because my natural frequency doesn't fall in this bandwidth. Partly because when we talk about context, I think we have to remember that a lot of what we do is based on empiricism. And therefore, we start looking for context. But if you have some theory, then it's possible to understand where it will work in which context. Let me give a crude example. Suppose I buy a balloon today in London at 3 degrees and get onto a plane and take that balloon to Delhi at 40 degrees, and it becomes bigger. But I don't know any physics. So when I land in Delhi and I see these hordes of Indians approaching me, so my thought would be, this is a different culture. So a balloon must have expanded because of these, what should I say, hot-haired Indians. So you invent context, and if you don't know theory, to understand what's happening. As a bad historian, I can also talk of another mega project, which is the building of the capital of India between in the late 20s and 30s. and they built wide avenues, and the houses of the VIPs were located away from the boundary wall so that the natives, if they rebelled, the bullet of the 202 would not go through the window. And the roads were wide enough so that tanks and armies could operate to save the local people from the natives. But today we are celebrating that city because the British had such foresight to have a green city and build wide roads for the traffic of today. So that's how context changes. And it was a successful project because we have wide roads for a lot of cars now. And so the whole issue of how we decide something is successful is also partly based on some of that. The power of context is, we also keep talking about path dependency. And that we discuss based on the past path dependency on how a project is chosen. But I would suggest that the future path dependency is decided by the mega project. And that path dependency instructs that that project has to be successful, no matter what you do. Because after you invested the money, you cannot get rid of it. And therefore, I would be an idiot to say it has not succeeded. And I'll always find enough professionals and academics years later to say, now the context has changed and you see it's even better. And so a mega project cannot fail, by definition, because of its path dependency. And that's part of the problem. Because once you have mega technologies, they're not necessarily, since they're not necessarily neutral, they cannot be really organic. And therefore, how they operate, the context is also decided by power structures within society. And the power structures change in how much disparity you have in your society, and what is the power structure of professionals, and what's the power structure of corporations. So if you have a society in which you have great disparities, it will be different from a power structure in a society where 70% is middle class. So what the middle class does has a greater voice for the same technology in opposing it or supporting it than in a society where the upper class is very small but very powerful and has international support for obvious reasons. And therefore, the upper class of a society where there are great disparities, the upper class in today's world will support multinational corporations for obvious reasons. And multinational corporation power structure has a different effect on local expertise, professors, politicians, and bureaucrats than in a rich society which is more middle class. So the ambassadors of the respective companies, their only job is to have those mega projects implemented in those countries. So the ambassadors of Japan, or Germany, or General Electric, or Bombardier, those ambassadors can meet my prime minister about 50 times more often than I can. So the local professional's role in deciding what should happen becomes different. So the context is not culture. Context, and also, if I get a grant from Volvo, it makes a difference from Harry getting a grant from Volvo because of the difference in, I don't mean that very seriously. It could be any other company. But the point being that these power structures are used among professionals with a purpose. And I should take my earlier comment away, because the Volvo has not operated that way, because we don't have a mega project from Volvo. But it is a very serious issue, and that's why we can have 6 cities in India planning to build monorails. Because the power structure of the companies which promote monorails can influence scientists, professors, bureaucrats, and politicians. Much more, in a different way, they can influence them in Sweden or Germany. And I think, so this whole issue of power structure among professionals, among politicians, and the public at large. Because if 80% of your population has never seen or understand or has no concept of the new project, what it does in the long run, it does not have a role in decision making. And so even a poor person in Delhi can ride a metro once and say, this is fantastic, without understanding that if I took the investment of the first 60 kilometers of metro in Delhi and put it in a bank, then from interest alone, I could send 50% of Delhi's children to a private school forever. So the question is not cost benefit, it is cost effectiveness. That is, what would I gain by not doing this project, but doing entirely something else? And what difference would that make to my society in the future? And so, if, for example, I delayed my metro rail in Delhi by 10 years and invested just the interest of the capital involved, I could send every single child of Delhi to a private school, a good school, forever. So after 10 years, we would have a different society in Delhi. Now, how do I compare that with transporting 3% of Delhi's people underground by rats and snakes? So you benefit, so 3% of Delhi's population benefits from this mega project, which has been funded from the tax money of the whole country. So when I want to evaluate the success of this project, how do I do it? And I think that's my problem. It is not seeing whether the project is successful as a project, but what would it do if I had not done it and done completely something else in our society? And I think those are the questions which we have to start thinking about, especially because I think what we're going to see in Asia, Africa, South America, is a few billion people changing their lifestyles in the next 20 years and growing with great aspirations, unlike here. And this number of people have never, ever been uplifted, or whatever you want to call it, in such numbers ever before in the world. So unless we start understanding what mistakes mega projects can make, we have a serious problem, because this is going to be I can see it's going to be very fast. And we're going to make mega mistakes. And the only reason I worry about it is when I think about my daughters, or look at my daughter's eyes 80 years after I'm gone, 60 years after I'm gone. Because it won't affect me, but it does bother me sometimes that if these projects have those effects, will she live in India or will she live in Sweden? My suspicion is she might want to live in Sweden. So the issues are much more serious in that sense. The other issue is that when we talked earlier this morning, the concept of passionate minorities, the question of passionate minorities can come down to in unequal societies of 3 people who are very passionate with power. And so if my minister just heard the previous presentation that China has 17 cities with metros, maybe he's heard them actually. So he's asked 70 cities of our country last week to submit proposals for metros. So he's a very passionate minority of 1. And so my only hope is that our cities don't have the money to do it. And that is the only decision-making process which will moderate that system, not the professionals. And I have not seen any international set of professionals from anywhere in the world who have given a reasonable critique of what is being done in these cities up to today, in spite of all our meetings and all our discussions of sustainability and so on, in spite of studies from Berkeley and other places on the life cycle costs of some of these metros and mega projects. For example, for CO2, the studies from here, from Europe, studies from Berkeley, our own study which we recently completed in a thesis on our institute shows that the CO2 produced per passenger at the Delhi Metro is more than a bus system running at half capacity in India. Because of the CO2, and this is because of CO2, that is when you have a project where the infrastructure is costs are much bigger than operational infrastructure. And if your power is produced by coal or petrol or diesel, then the CO2 produced totally, including the power station, is very high compared to a system on the surface which has less infrastructure compared to its operating costs. So I guess the whole issue of judging mega projects will have to come down to, in a sense, delaying them. I can't think of any other way of having any reasonable decision making. Or I can't think of a process of decision making which will be just, except by delaying. And by delaying, some of them will get stopped, but under the pressure, some other solution will have to be found because it can be done cheaper. So I think our job as professionals in our part of the world is to delay what we ideologically think is not good. I'm not really interested at that level then at all these fancy calculations and so on and so forth. I think what we think, what is our vision of a reasonable life in the future, becomes more important than cost-benefit analysis. Because at times our visions can be a little more, that is my vision I think, it can be a little better than what a good life is than many other things. And I think we'll have to start talking about what we want as a just life more than mega projects in terms of will they be actually successful after 30 years in spite of other problems today? Because you can justify anything after 30 years or 40 years because you don't have a choice. And I think that's part of the issue. And the communities, when we talk about communities, it has to do with the concept of nation states. This is my last point. It's a concept of nation states. Nation states basically evolved as monolingual entities with a border, with one dominant majority with one religion. So decision making by communities in those nation states is a different process than post-colonial nation states, which the concept of the monolingual single religion nation state as a dominant group is transplanted into artificial boundaries post-1950 with many languages, many communities, many religions, and the concept of communities then is not the same in that nation state. And the warring, and it's not a question of tribes or jungle bunnies walking around making trouble. It's a question of the whole concept of nation state being flawed in the modern world, where you have many competing nationalities in the same country. And so there'll obviously be conflict, there'll obviously be differences of interest between community groups, national groups, and income groups. And within that, our decision making in mega projects becomes even more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next commenter, David, is commentary. So, are you ready to start? Yes. Okay. Good. So,
good afternoon. My name is David. I'm from the University of Salaam and part of ACET, African Center of Excellence on Public and Motorized Transport. According to we're in the center together with the University of Cape Town and the University of Nairobi, Kenya. I'm going to present, I think the program shows an observation from South Africa, but actually it's from Africa, and mostly I come from Tanzania. So the observation I'm going to present are mostly based on my experience in Tanzania. One of the major projects that we are implementing now is the construction of the VREF system. But again, also I would like to generalize my observation and cover some other sub-Saharan African countries based on the observation that I've made in visiting those countries and in my interaction with professionals in those countries as well. So my observation do not claim to comprehensively cover all African situations. If we see in some other countries in Africa that things are happening differently, it could be the case, but these are the most common observations that I could make, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa. First, regarding the lesson 1, that MTPs is agents of change. Now, my observation is that a few projects in Africa are planned as agents of change. The majority are planned as purely provider of transport infrastructure. And in the event that they turn out to be agents of change, then it's usually the private sector that takes advantage of the subsequent developments rather than the public or the government. The second lesson, MPPs as open systems. Again, the majority of projects in Africa, I would consider them to be as closed systems. Why? Because they are going to be easier and less complicated to handle. And once you have already planned your project, then you don't go back and change it. It's easier that way, and it's less complicated. So most of them are planned that way. Now, you have talked in your finding that there are cases in which there is transition from a closed to an open system, usually as a result of pressure from stakeholders. Well, there are such transitions, but mostly they are a result of inadequate resources. That the project was planned as a closed system, and then somewhere in between you find out that the resources allocated do not match the need. And therefore you go back and start reconsidering, but not as a result of pressure from, rarely as a result from pressure from stakeholders. On the third lesson of MTPs is organic phenomena. Usually the original project visions, concepts and objectives remain firmly fixed in most cases for the project. Time to breathe is usually not planned for in many transport projects, and usually they have very strict timelines for completion and implementation. Now, if an opportune time to breathe presents itself, in most cases it's not taken advantage of. For example, in the case of the BRT in Dar es Salaam, the buses were supposed to start operating in 2009, it was moved to 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, but I cannot see them operating in 14. The infrastructure is still being constructed. But again, in between there are a lot of questions which are being raised, and there is enough time to review the project objectives and the implementation, but no advantage is taken although the time to breathe is presenting itself. On the framing of MTPs, the nature and clarity of MTP visions, goals and objectives are mostly not very clear. Thus, some of them start on the wrong footing from the very beginning. And we have a huge problem in Africa of over-dependence on international consultants, donors, and funding institutions, which usually set the visions and objectives rather than the spectators. And when it comes to measuring success, the iron triangle, success is mostly measured in terms of accomplish completing the project in time, having no cost overruns, and this participation that is really what is considered to be success for the project. We can run into trouble if you don't meet this or otherwise. Lesson 5, the power of context. Context is not adequately considered. And most major transport projects, their planning, appraisal, delivery tends to follow what are called best practices with a little consideration for context. You can understand where the best practices come from. This was implemented in Canada, this is where, and then let's follow the best practice. So we need consideration for context. And I can imagine that most of the failures that have occurred, and it seems that it is because they not acknowledge the influence of the context. But again, there is an issue of institutional capacity, which is lower in African countries. I consider it to be a major part of the context. And it is usually not adequately considered. Institutional capacity is completely considered, and therefore you get into trouble with many major transport projects. I've seen this with the case of VREF system, and I think it is the case in most other projects. And lesson 6, role of sustainable development visions. First, it is not very clear what constitutes sustainable development. Therefore, it leads into sometimes unrealistic visions. Now, because major projects usually need a lot of funding, and most countries in Africa depend on the funding from the world, donors, World Bank, etc. They are forced then to accept elements of sustainable development that mostly depend on the growth of societies. And it's something priority in those cases. In the case of engaging with the stakeholders, in most cases you find those funding the projects have more say than stakeholders, including the government. When the government is funding the project, it has more say than the other stakeholders. And as you had found in your findings, that there is a lack of trust, credibility, and transparency. This is actually more so in Africa, and therefore it is very difficult to build a certain relationship with the stakeholders. But the lower levels of democratization in Africa also do not help. But again, the level of education in society also excessively the situation. Leadership alluded to that in his presentation, that a lot of people don't understand a lot of things. And therefore, you can get away with a lot of things, and you cannot actually consult them. For example, you are consulting a BRT in Dar es Salaam, I could say 99.9% of the people don't know what a BRT is. Even my very close friends who are very well educated, they keep asking, what is it? How does it operate? And I've been explaining to people until I'm tired, and just wait and see when they pass ahead, because I cannot explain to everybody. So you can imagine you go about and try to consult such people on whether you need a BRT or give your opinion, etc. Nobody knows exactly what it looks like. It's a very thing. Institutional policy and legislative support. These actually, the frameworks are usually underdeveloped in most cases, and therefore they don't deliver the program of conservation benefits. But where these frameworks are developed, observance is also a problem. They can easily be neglected. So it's a problem either way. Again, most successes in major projects are attributed to powerful political champions. If you have a powerful politician who owns the project and say, I want to see it through, whether it's the presidency, then usually it can be successfully implemented. But again, usually the political influence is overdone, and in some cases, in most cases that we see, it becomes counterproductive as technical advice is overruled. Professionals give advice, but again, politicians will just neglect it and say, this is how it has to be done. And on the last lesson, on learning sharing, Again, as I said, most still mega transport projects are planned, designed, and delivered by international companies who say with proven experience. If it is a mega project, there is no local company that has that experience. So basically, you're going to engage international companies. But again, when you have another mega project, you know, they want experience. So the local company will not have experience again. So it is a vicious circle of international companies. The local public institutions are usually less interested in learning. They don't think that they need to do that. But private companies and consultants are interested in learning. But again, it doesn't help them to get future jobs. So when it comes to learning and sharing, it's a little bit complicated. But again, post-project evaluation is a reality, it's never done actually, unless a big project arises. So those are my observations.
The organization of David was great, and I have something that is not as organized as that, but I think many of the topics I will comment cover the same issues. If I think of mega projects in the developing world, basically in Latin America, well, since I am the leader of the Fast Rapid Transit Center of Excellence, most of my discussion will be based on urban transportation projects. In the developing world, this is a very relevant discussion because there's lots going on, as Ines was saying, in China, in India, also in Brazil, in Africa. There's many of these mega projects going on, and it seems, I agree also that there may be mega problems ahead. And the problems that have been raised by Omega are very similar most of the time to what we see in the developing world. Certainly, if we think of these countries, the context is very relevant, and we could discuss a lot about this. And also, I would like to go a little deep into the need of the political champions. Sometimes you don't have the political champions, but you may have a pivotal circumstance that allow you to really to address and implement a certain big project, even though you don't have the right leader. But the circumstances may give the opportunity to implement, and we've seen that happening. It's more frequent instead of having those big champions that can look ahead. Usually our political leaders, I think, in the developing world are mostly looking only within their time in charge, and therefore that makes it very difficult for these projects that will have a long-term benefit to happen. So only if you have a specific circumstance. For instance, in my city, it was a huge strike of the bus operators, what allowed you to do a big transformation in the big industry. Without a strike, no way you would have that problem. Another problem we have with these champions is that usually the authority in these cities are very fragmented. Not all the time, but very often. And so it's very difficult, especially when you're looking at the urban environment, to have a single view of what should be done, and a single person that could really take the lead on putting all these pieces together. You may sometimes even have within a city like mine, maybe 30, 40 local authorities that would like to take their own decision or their own part on how this system is delivered. There's also the issue of limited availability of resources. And this is a major issue, especially because the leaders would like to build this mega project, but all of the time they will have this very significant budget, which most of the time is not enough, and therefore they will end up implementing systems or designing systems that are failed from the very beginning, just because they are not well done, just because you've been in some way cheap in the details, and sometimes it is in the details where the level of service, for instance, is played. And I think that's also a significant problem that where you may end up with poor solutions, where by the end people will be disappointed. I also think that these mega projects have this need to, when we're evaluating this project, we need to address all the elements that are involved that usually go well beyond the more direct cost-benefit analysis. And I don't think we have the right evaluation tools to do the right work and foresee the benefits that sometimes are hard to imagine. Very often, these mega projects bring benefits that you really need a political vision of what will happen, because there's no way that you will be able to put those benefits within an equation to say, well, this is going to be the final social rentability or social benefit of the system. I see that these mega projects tend to be adaptable. In Latin America especially, since it's very hard for us to put an idea and take it to the very end. But also, of course, they tend, once you put them, to force the environment to adapt. And therefore, there's a significant challenge on how you're gonna, as I said before, predict how the system is going to adapt. Sometimes you implement a certain solution, a certain investment, and all of a sudden it can trigger a lot of benefits. Sometimes it don't, and very often, especially if you think about public transport, those benefits take a long time to arise. And if we consider that those benefits are usually divided by the social ratio, elevated to the power of the number of years, if this would happen in year 10, those benefits are going to be miserable. And I think that's a problem we have also when we're looking at this kind of system. Also, especially I think more than in the developed world, we have a lot of what we call white elephants. I think that is the same concept here. And the question here is why they happen. And there's comes the first issue is, well, what happens with corruption, which in Latin America is sometimes common. How often those poor projects are the result of a corrupt first line of politicians or of technicians, and also how often they are just the result of poor demand forecasting capabilities. Also, I think it raises a very important topic, which is, especially once you start using private-public partnerships, how do you design the right contracts? I think that's a huge topic. Contracts that where you really can address the goals of the society and align them with the goals of the private operator, especially in a project that for sure will be changing. I mean, if there's something you know, that the project will probably won't be, here's the key, open the door. And it's not going to be like this. There's going to be a lot of change, and you know that every time you have to renegotiate those contracts, the society will be harmed because they will be put in a bad position. And I think that's something that we need to address. I don't think we have the right tools. And when we're thinking of this this issue with contracts, we realize that the system we're addressing, especially when we're talking about urban projects, is the issue of complexity. I mean, it's not the same as we were talking yesterday, today in the morning. There are some projects that are straightforward, simple to do, just a connection, do it well. But there are many others where, for instance, the Big Dig, where you really have a lot of things. You're going to the center of downtown. You're gonna address several modes at the same time. It's gonna change the city, and that makes it much harder to address. I think that also makes a big challenge for people that are pushing or BRT systems or trying to make the world think of alternatives to rail, because metros seems to be a much simpler way to address the problem. You go and buy the full solution. I mean, nobody would say, oh, you have to knock there to get the tunnels. You knock right there for the stations. Hopefully someone will give you the control system, and then after that you have to go and buy the trains. No, probably what you'll get is a full solution. When you're talking about BRT, the problem we have is exactly the opposite. There's nothing like a closed solution. There's nothing like one person would say, we have a solution that will allow you to solve all the problems at once, and we can guarantee that everything will be consistent. And I think that that's a major problem, especially with politicians that, of course, and naturally, are very risk averse. And what you want is to be sure that by my 5th year, I will have something that people would like, that I will have the chance to inaugurate. And I don't want to have risks of, even if it's cheaper, I don't mind. So I think that's an issue, especially when we're talking in the previous discussion of international firms selling these solutions to developing countries, where these solutions are just one part of the problem. You're just selling the buses. On February, a group of our center was talking to people in Volvo buses, about this point. I mean, it's not just about buses. It's not just about selling buses. One thing is selling the buses, but the same bus can be part of a failure solution or of a successful solution. The same bus. The same bus can be a motivation of pride or of embarrassment. So the question is, if you really want to solve the mobility problem, if you really want to be proud of what you've done, you need to think more creatively and probably be more closer to the authority so that the whole solution makes sense. So firms like Volvo need to be much more creative and think out of the box, right? So I think this is the issue of the risk, and I think that buses have a much more. If you want to sell buses, if you want to push forward the alternative of a more cheaper alternative, a more rational alternative of buses. There's a big challenge in terms of the risk of the final solution. And that takes me also to the, I will go through also to the issue of citizen participation. In developing countries, citizen participation is much more challenging, especially because of the education issue. I was amazed to hear that in London, for instance, the congestion charging was not something that Livingstone pushed by himself, but because, what I understood, that businesses from downtown said we need to solve this problem, why don't we charge for congestion? That would never happen in a country like ours. Never. You don't have people that will be able to have the idea, not the, as you said, there's no link with the authority, there's no possibility that could happen. Big firms, as you said, have much more access to authorities than really sometimes the citizens. And finally, I would like to go through what is a successful project in my perspective, and what's a failure project. And I think there's also here of how can we filter the media regarding what really is a successful project. Because it is the media the one that will convince us what if a certain project has failed, has been good. And I believe since the media is usually so dominated by more affluent people, most likely you won't have a very clear picture. So I think there's also there an issue of being able to filter and have post-project evaluation on the impact and benefits finally of the project. Also, there's the issue of the time frame you used. Sometimes the inauguration was bad. Nobody came to the system. But, well, you cannot really evaluate a system in short time frame. Sometimes a metro line, for instance, in my city, takes 10 years to show up its potential. So that there's also I think that's an issue that should be considered. Finally, not only consider the impact of the transportation, I think, especially in an urban context, not only the impact of transportation, travel times and waiting times, it's much more than that, and there's so many elements that need to be considered that a successful project should that should be included. And my final issue is in terms of this long-term impact is, for instance, if I compare, as I will be doing tomorrow, if you compare that two cities like Bogotá and Santiago, you'll see two cities that one of them has built a network of metro, the other one has built a network of BRT, Bogotá. If you compare the level of service of both cities, it's exactly the same. 100 kilometers, same travel time, door-to-door average and deviation for the two cities. However, Bogotá is much more successful in limiting the rise of the modal share of the cars. Because in some way, they have taken by their solution not just a solution for people using public transport, but also taking some space from the cars. Metro was in Santiago, what we've done is we've said, okay, fine, we're going to provide a good solution for people using public transport, and the streets are yours. And therefore, the modal share of the car has been growing and growing. So if you're going to look at the project, I think there's so many other elements that need to be addressed, especially if you're looking not just to the front of your nose, but decades ahead. And I'm going to finish there.